Leo is a shark. Join the Legion.
So we are talking Thrash from 2026, and this is the new shark movie from Netflix and Sony. And this one is directed and written by Tommy Vakova, who you may know from the director of the movie Violent Night, but also has some horror pedigree in the form of the Dead Snow movies. So what's the story? So we have an American coastal town which at the very beginning of the movie is battered by a hurricane, and the movie follows a couple of groups of people who are kind of cut off in their homes as they this town is flooded, and this kind of hurricane, this tsunami, brings with it a load of bull sharks and also one pregnant great white shark, and the movie follows these kind of groups of people trying to survive the elements, the rising tides, but also these hungry sharks that have been now kind of washed up in this kind of urban environment. At the same time, you've got Digimon Honsu's character, oceanic kind of scientist, and he's there trying to try and save his niece, who is one of the characters in the movie. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So, does this premise sound familiar? Well, it should, because this premise you have seen before in an actual shark movie called Bait, but also the movie Crawl that came out a few years ago, with practically identical, storyline, to be brutally honest with you. Even in Netflix's own Under Paris shark movie, the finale of that one had Paris being flooded, and obviously sharks kind of swimming around the streets of Paris. So the movie's premise isn't especially original, it must be said, but let's talk about what works in this movie's favour. Now, this isn't some low-budget throwaway shark movie. This looks like it has a reasonable budget behind it. The scenes of this kind of hurricane and tsunami smashing through the town, and these waves of water, which happen pretty early on in the movie. You're not having to wait very long here. I think look really good, and I have to say that the production value here looks particularly impressive in those sequences. Thinking, is this CGI? How have they done it? It looks very, very impressive. And the initial kind of wave of destruction, where we see kind of trucks being kind of pushed aside and houses being destroyed, I think looks incredible. And I have to say as well, when we see our sharks, I think the sharks effects look very good. Pretty much all of the shark effects, I think, are impressive. There's one or two that look a little bit kind of CGI, but I would say for the most part here, the actual effects are very, very impressive. And this obviously goes hand in hand with, obviously, there's a slightly higher production value than you might get in the your garden variety kind of shark attack movies that we seem to get in recent years. But yeah, so a good amount of production value here, some slickly produced special effects, and as I said, the action starts very early on, so the pace of this movie is quite quick. You're not having to wait long at all before the action starts, and once it does, it really is one thing after another for a variety of kind of different people. I think the actual attacks, when we sort of see them, they're nothing especially gory, but I think they still are fairly kind of well done. PG-13, PG-12 kind of level of kind of violence here. And they haven't kind of overdone it with the sharks. They're not like huge monster sharks. They are actually kind of like relatively realistically sized, maybe with the exception of the great white, which has a breaching scene at the end, which I think is a little bit over the top. But nonetheless, I think for the most part the sharks kind of are presented like sort of somewhat kind of realistically. And obviously bull sharks, as you've probably known from other shark movie reviews that I've mentioned, are able to kind of swim in kind of fresh water, so you can kind of get away with maybe it's not pure seawater, it's the rivers are overflowing, things like that, so you can kind of get away with maybe some kind of the sketchy sort of science maybe. I think the acting is fairly solid here. I think the cast are a little are doing a good job with the kind of the roles that they've got. I think some of the kind of the characters are a little broad, but I think the acting is pretty solid here. Everyone does a decent enough job. I believe them in their roles, and we have some kind of interesting sort of character choices here. We split into two groups of people. We have 2 women, one of which is agoraphobic. She is the niece of Digimon Hansu's character. A little bit afraid to kind of leave the house. This obviously is going to come into to play later. And then she rescues this woman who is pregnant and literally about to give birth. And obviously, you can imagine having that sort of complication in the middle of a tsunami with sharks all around. So, then we have another kind of group of people where we have a foster family with 3 kids and 2 foster parents. And I think all the characters who are meant to be likeable are very, very likeable. We can kind of root for them. They are designed in a way to be very digestible and kind of easy to root for, and they are easy to root for. They're a little broad, and we'll talk about some of that in the negatives, but it can't be said that you want these characters all to kind of survive and kind of and hope for the best for them. So that in a way it works despite some of the kind of the flaws I'm going to mention. I think the movie doesn't outstay its welcome. It's not a particularly long movie, so it's quite kind of punchy, and just the general presentation is just pretty strong. What doesn't work for me, there's some out of place humour here and there. I think some of the kind of the humorous moments, air quotes, fall a little flat. It's not too many of them, but there are a couple of times here where I thought, I don't know if that really worked, to be honest with you. So some of the kind of the jokes here, albeit there's not many of them, are a little misjudged. To me, the issue with the movie is it's very broad. I mean, like I say, you have seen this movie before, even in actual kind of like with sharks in the movie Bait, but again more recently with Crawl. So it doesn't feel particularly original. It feels like this premise has been done a couple of times before. So why do more or less kind of the exact same premise again without really adding anything particularly kind of new to it, to be honest? I mean, I guess maybe it's felt that people haven't seen Bait or Crawl perhaps, but there it is. So yeah, the premise is a little unoriginal, to be honest. How the movie plays out is kind of predictable. Let me put it like this: everyone who you think is going to survive will survive. Everyone who you think will die will die. Anyone who is kind of a little bit mean is going to end up coming croppers. Anyone who hasn't got much character work is going to end up coming croppers. You see a character and they're just introduced. We haven't seen them before. Right, you're going to die. So it's fairly obvious, and even some of the kind of the setup here is a little on the nose. For example, we have this this kind of lorry, this truck, which is full of kind of like meat waste and kind of blood and stuff, and of course that gets split open, thus attracting all the sharks. Of course, this woman is just about to kind of give birth, and obviously creates a kind of a blood to attract shark. Of course, this woman is agoraphobic, so she's going to have to try and overcome that fear and everything like that. Of course, we see foreshadowing about how to kind of use a gun and things like this, and of course we see foreshadowing about there's some stakes in this particular room. So there's a lot here that is kind of like very sort of somewhat basic sort of storytelling. It's fun, it's cheesy, it's not particularly deep, it's not particularly kind of intelligent, you might say. It very much is like, look, here's something that's going to come into play later on in the movie. Look, here's something else which is going to come in later on in the movie. So the foreshadowing here is extremely obvious. And the characters, as I say, the particular situations they're in, they're fun situations, but they feel a little precarious in regards to, it just happens that all of the characters that we see happen to have this kind of like element which is going to cause them a problem or give them something to overcome in the movie. No one is just some guy in his flat who, just is trapped there for whatever reason. Everyone's got this extra thing kind of going on. So, it's a little silly and cheesy at times, and as I say, not especially original, but if you can kind of get over this, it's a fun movie. I think it's well made. I think it's well produced. If you just want a slickly produced movie with, for the most part, good effects. There's one sort of fairly obvious green screen, but for the most part, it's pretty good. That maybe isn't the deepest, maybe isn't the most original, and is somewhat cheesy. It's a good fun time if you can somewhat switch your brain off. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. What do you think of Thrash? If you've seen it, let me know your thoughts, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.